So when the pandemic broke out last year, I was just curious. There was a lot I had to learn myself about virus propagation. I didn't know much about virus propagation. And then once I learned it, it seemed like it really wasn't a very difficult concept. And it seemed that it should be possible to explain it and just play with it just with some very simple stuff that you can do in Excel. That's sort of the motivation. My son, who's a lot smarter than me, kept poking holes in whatever I was trying to do. And so I think it sort of improved as a result. So that's what I want to go through here. And the way to understand virus propagation, herd immunity, and be of some help when you're reading other literature, whatever. So that's the idea. And so I trust you have, you're able to get the slides PDF. And it'll be good if you have the spreadsheet now for sure. And the model description, I'll show a little bit in my talk, and you can always look at it later. And I'm very happy to talk to any of you after today or after class someday about the model. And so just some really simple stuff. Like if a virus comes into a community, one person comes in, or maybe 3 people come in. How does it, how do the number of people infected go? And it turns out it's a really very trivial formula. And it's not very different from what happens in a bank account. You have a loan or you have money in a fixed deposit, and the money grows, or your loan grows in time if you don't make payments. So say you borrow $10,000 and the annual interest is 10%. I have no idea what the going rates are, just to keep things simple. So what happens? At the end of 1 year, you're going to owe $11,000, right? $10,000 plus $1,000 interest. Now, after 2 years, you now have not just $12,000, but you also owe interest on the $1,000 interest on the first year. So, this is an important point. It's a crucial element of compound interest that you all may have had to learn in 9th grade and thought that you could, forget for the rest of your life. But it comes in with virus propagation. And after 3 years, it gets just rounded. Instead of 12,100, it's now 13,310. So you basically have to take $12,100, take 10% of that, add that, and you get 13,310. Assuming, of course, I did my arithmetic correctly. So you go on like that. So after n years, it's a very simple formula. It's $10,000 multiplied by 1.1 raised to n after n. So this is very simple stuff that I think you all know or feel like, you're pretty okay with it. So the number of infected by the virus increases the same way. So there is a basic symbol that was new to me called R0, and that R stands for reproduction. So that's the basic reproduction number. That's the expected secondary cases generated by one primary case. So if you have one person who is infected and they lead their normal life, not that they're not isolating, they don't even know they're infected, how many people can that person infect during their contagious period? So that's the R0. And the R0 is like the 1.1 in the compound interest example. So instead of years, though, what we want to work with is the cycle time. How long is a person contagious or infectious? Now, we generally assume that this particular virus, COVID-19, there is like a 15-day infectious period, right? I think people are, if you want to quibble whether it's 15 days or 13 days or 17 days, let's just for the sake of the talk here, we'll assume, it's a 15-day cycle. So that means we can think of the number of people infected growing just the same way as money in the bank grew. So you start with 1 person or 10 people, and then at the end of one cycle, they have now infected R naught times 10 people. And then the next time you have 10 times R naught to start with, and that's going to be multiplied by R naught. So suppose you start with 20,000 people infected at time 0. Number of cases after n cycles would just be 20,000 times R naught raised to n. That's the number of people who are going to be infected after n cycles. So this is a very simple formula. So it just blows up geometrically. I meant to have a slide, but I forgot. I don't know if people know. It's possible people of Asian background may know. There's a story set in various countries. When I was growing up, it was set in India. I don't know where chess was invented, but there's a story about guy invented chess, and then the king was so thrilled. He said, "You can have whatever you want." And the inventor said, "Well, I don't want much. Just give me, put stuff on a chessboard for me, and put 1 grain of rice or wheat on the first square, and then the next square give me double that, and the next square give me double that." And apparently the king was really pissed off that the guy was asking for so little. But of course, 2 to the 64 becomes a huge number, a lot of grain. And I think the king dealt with it, at least in my story, by killing the inventor. So, but aside, that's the formula. It's all. It's just a 20,000 times R naught to the n. This is a simplistic formula. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to make it a little better, and that also then makes it more realistic. And we'll talk about waves at some point. So in particular, it ignores the decrease in the number who can potentially be infected. As more and more people get infected, if I'm infected and if I go through my normal life and a lot of people around me are already infected, I can't infect R naught people. I don't have that opportunity because a lot of the people I could infect are already infected. And the same thing is going to come up with vaccination. If a lot of people around me are vaccinated, then I can't be infecting them. And this is where we'll get to concept of herd immunity. If you go to our webpage, biomed.net/virus, you will see this write-up. But before we get into detail about our model, it's good to have some pictures. And so this is one way to understand what I've been talking about. So you have an index patient 0, infects 2 people, each of them infects 2 people, and so on. And that's how it just becomes to the end, right? That is for R naught equal to 2, right? But in fact, COVID-19 is a lot more active than that. So even the original virus that we all saw last year had an R naught close to 3, 2.8 or something like that. So that means that the index case now infects 3 people, and each of them infects 3 people, and so on. Now you can see after 1, 2, 3 cycles, whereas R naught of 2, you end up with 15 people infected. With an R naught of 3, you have like 40 people who are infected. So it makes a big difference with respect to R naught, whether it is 2 or 3 or 1.5 or 1.2 and so on. Each of those numbers really makes a big difference because each cycle you're going to be multiplying by that quantity. And so this is some thing I picked up on a web page, some formulas for compound interest. So the basic compound interest formula, as I already told you. Okay, so I think I'm ready to talk about our model now. I make no claim that the model or the data that, the simulation that I'm going to show you or that you can do by playing with our model fits the US data to date or will in the future. There are just many, many factors that I'll talk about some of them along the way that make a very simple model. It's not capable of describing a very complex situation like the US society or any society. The goal, rather, is to provide you a simple tool with which to understand R0 and how, and this is the main point for me, how small changes in R0, seemingly small changes in R0, due to policy, can mean big difference in the outcome. So the spreadsheet, I try to show what may happen when R0 changes to different values under different mandate policy. I'm not going to show the math very much, the formulas in Excel. I will do that towards the end. But if anybody is interested, it's all visible. The formulas are not hidden in any way. And they're also explained at the bottom of the spreadsheet. So, okay. So I would like you to open the spreadsheet. And this is what you should see in the first tab. And I'll try to go through some of the parameters, as I call them, that go into the model and how they influence what happens. In general, what we tried to do was to have cells in yellow background, and those would be cells that you might want to change, that things that you might be interested in exploring, what would be the effect of changing one of these parameters. Whereas the cells that don't have the yellow background are generally calculated by the model from the values in the yellow cell. So basically, the yellow cells are describe the model in some way. You tell the model, this is what is happening, and so now I want to see what the effect of this is. So to keep things simple, the population is set at 100 million, and that's this cell. So if you actually wanted to do it for different size populations, you could change it. But the curves are not going to be any different. It's just that the scales would be different. I want to assume that at this point, maybe 10% of the population is infected. And so that is this parameter. I was watching something yesterday and reading. There seems to be some thought that the proportion infected at this point may be more than 10%. Maybe it is between 15 and 20%. There are different views on that, and so we can change that and see what happens. Now, this is an assumption again about mortality. What is the mortality risk of an infected person? And I have I've convinced myself, reading somewhat carefully until recently, that it's around 1%. Now, this is a figure that is not easy to get, because you don't actually know how many people are infected. You have to rely on testing information, but the testing is not random, and so since we don't know exactly what proportion of the population is infected, it's hard to know what the mortality risk is. I do believe, unlike, for instance, data from India, I don't believe data from India at all. I think the government just makes up what they want the public to believe. But in the US, I do believe the COVID-19 mortality rate. I think that is a solid number. By state, etc., I'm willing to believe. Though actually, I read recently that Florida, apparently the government is not too interested in knowing about COVID-19 deaths. So it could be that they are behaving like the Indian government. But leaving that aside, I trust the death data in the US. And I don't know what the mortality risk should be. But again, if you're playing with the model, you could change that. I read a paper recently that suggested that it used to be 1% and now it is down to 0.5%. I don't know. R0. So this is the key, as I mentioned before. To some extent, R0 has to be inferred from the statistics. So for instance, if you can easily get statewide statistics. I claim that deaths are proportional to the number infected in the previous cycle. So if the deaths are going up by some factor from 1 2-week period to the next 2-week period, then I can sort of infer what the R0 is in that state, right? So if you actually wanted to use this model to try to follow what is happening in some place, what you would do is to look at death count, say for a few consecutive half-month cycles, half-month periods. And then that ratio will be R0, roughly. There are modifications and so on, but it wouldn't be a bad approximation to R0. That's what I think. I mean, it's a great question. And I'm taking the attitude here that I want to illustrate what happens under different R0s. But your question is very reasonable. What R0 should I use if I want to try to see what is going on? And I think that that would be my approach. I sort of use that in coming up with some R0s here, by looking at what was happening to the deaths. So if you see the number of deaths doubling, like in one 15-day period to the next, then it's very likely that R0 is around 2. And so on. Yeah. I gave the example before, if you had 20,000 people, then you're going to have so many, say R0 is 2. So 20,000 will become 40,000, right, in the next 15 days. And then the 40,000, they will infect 2 each, and it will become 80,000, right? But I'm assuming a 1% mortality rate. So that means in the 20,000, some 200 are going to die. And in the next 15-day period, I have 40,000 infected, so 400 are going to die. And the next 80,000, 800 are going to die. So it is true that R0 relates to the infection, but I want to believe that mortality risk, whatever it is, whether it is 1%, 2%, or whatever, or 0.5%, that is fixed. So if you have twice the number of people getting infected, you're going to have twice the number of deaths. I believe death data, death statistics. I don't have so much confidence in the number of cases. So for the purposes of simulation and just to see what the effects of different policies would be, I chose a few different R0 values. For instance, I have an R0 of 2.75 for some area where I think there is actual, hostility to mandates on the part of the government, and somewhat reflecting the population also, perhaps. And then you have places maybe where there is no mandate, but the governors are interested in people getting vaccinated and so on. So, so I have 2.75, 2.5. You can see there'll be a difference even between 2.75 and 2.5. And then I have other areas where I have 2.25 and 2 and so on. So this is one source of variation in the different responses. So now there are more yellow cells here that I want to talk about. So the number infectious is the number of cases in the previous 15 days. So that's a key assumption in the model to keep things simple. So of course, every day people are getting infected and they're infecting other people. But for convenience, I just divide time into 15-day chunks. And I say, let me look at everybody who gets infected in one 15-day cycle. And so now I'm going to assume that they are all infectious in the next cycle, but only for the next cycle, because in the next cycle, they would have had their 15 days of being infectious and be done with it. And what they would have infected whomever they were going to infect. So the number infectious in any cycle is the number of cases in the previous cycle. So that I have assumed is starting off at 1.5 million. I'm assuming that in this 100 million population, there are 1.5 million people who were infected and in the previous, just before I start the thing. And people who are vaccinated are also immune to being infected. So that has to go into the calculations. And So looking at the statistics, those statistics seem to be reliable as well. The fraction vaccinated seems to range between 30 and 68%, something like that. So there are some states in the north, like Vermont, I think, who have very high vaccination rate, and there are some places in the south that have very low vaccination rate. So again, I'm assuming that places where there is a lot of hostility to mandates and so on, there is also lower levels of vaccination. And so that also goes into the model. And again, that's something you can change. So all the numbers in yellow can be changed to see what happens. So this now I'm showing the right side of that of the spreadsheet. So so these areas where there was some vax or mask mandate, I'm assuming R naught would be smaller, and then that also would influence how many people are infectious at a moment, to even at a starting point. So the place what I call sane, where there's a lot of restrictions, mandates, and so on, I would expect fewer people to be infectious even to start the whole simulation. And so this 200,000, whereas I think I had a much higher number in the 1.5 million in the insane states. And again, vaccination rates can be different depending on whether you have a mandate or not. So I think you all know when a city says you can't go into eating places or entertainment places if you're not vaccinated, vaccination rates go up. So the vaccination mandate has a very direct effect on people getting vaccinated. And that's, that I put in a couple of values. I have no idea if these are correct. I have some overall impression of what the vaccination rates are like at the moment, and that's what. And then finally, you have some people who simply will not get vaccinated, regardless of what the science says, or maybe especially if the science says something, they want to believe something opposite. And so there could be a fraction of the population that will not get vaccinated, even however much you tell them. But I do make an exception. I say that they do get vaccinated if there is a vax mandate. So if the state demands that they be vaccinated in order to hold their jobs or in order to go into public places, then they are going to get vaccinated, even if they're hostile to it. Whereas in states without mandates, they're not going to get vaccinated. So again, you may feel that there's too much detail I'm going into, but even for the simple model, we felt that it was important to have these different parameters that one can explore. And looking at the actual numbers, so the spreadsheet, the rows basically give the numbers of new infections and deaths with time. So what you see here, just looking at the first two, what I call insane and awful, either anti-mandate or just no mandates, they start at the same point. The new infections in the first cycle is 2.2 million in both places, and the deaths are the same because previously, that's the number of infections was 1.5 million, and so 1% of that is 15,000, right? So that's all. Just the deaths are just a simple factor, 1% of whatever the number infectious is in the previous cycle. So you see the small difference in the R naught here ends up being reflected in the number of deaths between the two regions. They are very similar with respect to other parameters, but they differ with respect to what the policy R naught is. So here, there is hostility to mandates. Here, there is just not imposing mandates. And so you see that with this model, by 2 months, there is a big difference in the number of deaths between the two, because this R naught has that impact. 2.75 and 2.5 may not look that different, but in fact, they haven't. So we get a curve like this. This is something that you have in your spreadsheet. And so I have these 5 curves here, and you can see that these 2 curves really stand out. And the first 2 groups of states. And so you can see that, in fact, the outcome is very, very bad if there is no mandate at all. And so what you also see is that compared to these two, the deaths in the other three, with just a vax mandate or just a mask mandate or imposing everything, they are minuscule compared to the deaths in these two areas. But actually, I have another graph. Without those two regions, you can see here that, in fact, it does matter whether you have only one mandate or whether you have both mandates. So if you only have a vax mandate or you only have a mask mandate, it's not really awful or insane, but it's still a lot more than it needs to be. So if you have a same government that actually says you must mask and you must get vaccinated, then the effect is going to be very, very different on the deaths. So this is basically the goal of the model. So to see what the effects are of changing R0 on our vaccination rate on the outcome. And so any questions so far? Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I'm pretending here that children don't exist. And that's really unfortunate. I mean, I could rant about it because I do think that the FDA is being foolish in not approving these vaccines for kids under 12. I think it's a terrible thing. They're acting as if this is like chickenpox or something, where they can take their time to approve things. And there have been lots of reports saying that even when there are negative consequences from the vaccine, they are trivial compared to what you get from the virus. And so to not approve the vaccines for under 12 school-going children, I think is really awful. And now that's going to change, they are saying, in the next 2-3 weeks. So, so then this model will, you'll just include the children as well. But right now, I agree it's a terrible situation. Because kids are going to school now, many schools don't have masking, and so they're going to get infected and infect their families, and so it's terrible. Yeah. See, the original virus had an R0 of 2.8, but the Delta variant, it is thought has an R0 of like 7 or 8. And so then the question is, how much do these policies bring that R0 down by? And so I could have used a smaller value. But the point there is that even R0 of 2, let me see if I can. So even an R0 of 2, if you look at the top of the table, over here, yeah, even an R0 of 2, because I'm assuming 60% are vaccinated to start with, and you have 10% who are infected previously, so that cuts the effective R0 to 0.7. So that's why the curves are going down even from the beginning. See, if R0 were greater than 1, the curves should go up. So they all start with an R0 bigger than 1, but the effective R0 is not just the R0 that would happen with say, New York State's policies if nobody was infected to start with and nobody was vaccinated. So then we would see a certain increase because we're not in lockdown. And so there would be some transmission of the virus. And so I found, just playing with the numbers, that even if I gave the same state an R naught of 2, because a significant fraction, like more than 2/3, are either vaccinated or infected, the effective R naught is like, less than half of that. It's like 1/3. The 2 becomes 0.7. And that's why you see also in the mask mandate region as well, that 2 becomes 0.9. And the vax mandate, it becomes 2.25 becomes 1.0. So really, even just a mandate, one mandate, does cut R naught down to a point where you don't have a rise in the deaths. So it's really that. So it may be, there may be a little bit of confusion, because by R naught I'm talking about what it would be in the absence of previous infection or vaccination. But in practice, that R naught is going to be much smaller. No, but thank you. That's that's an important question. And so you see this here, right? So all these had R naught supposedly bigger than 1, bigger than 2 even. But in practice, they are not in actuality because of vaccination and previous infection. Okay, so the next question that I want to talk about is why do the curves come down? And the answer to Faithy's question is what I want to bring up now. And that is, the R naught can be 2 or 3 or whatever, but over time, as more people get infected and vaccinated, the actual R naught starts to go down. And as it goes down, once it hits 1 and goes below 1, the deaths are not going to climb anymore. They're going to go down. So that's what we are seeing here. So that's what is different from the simplistic formula I started off with, where it just grows geometrically. Every cycle it doubles or whatever happens, and it just keeps growing. A virus doesn't have that freedom, because it can only infect when there are uninfected people who are vulnerable, who can be infected. So this is the concept of herd immunity. And so that's what I want to talk about next. And so this is just a little joke. I used this slide last year. And so there are people who believed, I think people believed this in Sweden, and Boris Johnson, whom I can't stand, is not unique though. There are many people in this country also who thought, just let everybody get infected and then we'll be done with the virus. So, but somehow they wouldn't be thinking about the 1% of the infected who are going to die. My kids are around 40 now, and when they were young, our pediatrician was very positive about their getting chickenpox. Right? But there was no vaccine, and apparently those days people even had chickenpox parties. If a child had chickenpox, they would, friends, neighbors would gather and have the kids spend time with each other, because it was much better to get chickenpox as a child than as an adult. And so in our family, it didn't work out so well, because neither my wife, who grew up here, nor I had chickenpox before. So we both got chickenpox from our kids, and that wasn't so nice. But in general, our pediatrician's attitude was, when the kid gets chickenpox, don't keep the kid from school. Send the kid to school. Because you want to build this, and this is the herd immunity concept. If enough people get infected, then it's good in the long run. It even gets rid of the virus. So the diagram that I have of how the virus propagates gets complicated. First of all, we need to recognize that if we say R naught is 2, it doesn't mean the infected person is just meeting 2 people and infecting both. Every contact an infected person has, there is a certain chance of their infecting the other person. And the R naught simply says that for a normal person meeting some number of people with some probability of infecting each person, you end up infecting about 2 people. That's what an R naught of 2 means. So they say, for instance, maybe they come in contact with about 64 people and a 3% chance of infecting each person. So if you have a 3% chance of infecting each of 64 people, on the average, you're going to be infecting about 2 people. And so this is what is shown in the diagram. So you have an infected person and you put them with 64 people, 8 times 8 here, and they're not going to infect all of them. They're going to infect a couple of people. That's it. So this is what is actually happening, which is sort of compressed in that previous figure where we saw 1 infected person going to 2 infected people. In fact, this 1 infected person is seeing 64 people and infecting 2. So now we can talk about herd immunity. If suppose half of the 64 are immune, either they're already infected or they're vaccinated. Now, this person sees 64 people, but these 32, they can't infect. So now this 3% applies only to half of the 64. So they end up infecting 1 person. So this is the idea that leads to herd immunity. That this is what Katie's question before and so on, that R naught here is 2, but the R naught here is only 1. Because half the population is not susceptible. Going back to this thing, this is what, that even in the insane policy R naught of 2.75, it doesn't start off at 2.75. Instead, it actually starts at 1.485. And that's because 10% are already very infected and 40% have gotten vaccinated. So that means that close to, it's not quite 50%, because there are some people who are going to be both infected and vaccinated. So you have to, deal with that. So you end up with something close to 50% are immune. And so the effective R naught is roughly half of the 2.7. So that's why the new infections then, it's not 2.75 times 1.5 million, but 1.485 times 1.5 million. So you get this 2.2 million. And so then as you proceed, each cycle, the population now, more people are infected, right? Instead of 10% being infected originally, now you have an additional 2.2 million, and then additional 3.2 million and so on. And also, people are getting vaccinated. Even if not at the great rate that we would want, they are getting vaccinated as well. So proportion of people that are infected or vaccinated is going up with time. And so you find that even this 1.485 keeps going down. Each successive time here, you'll see that the increase is less and less until you get to just in a few cycles, by 2 months, there are enough people infected and vaccinated that it's leveled off now. The infections in the next cycle is slightly below, actually, the previous one, right? Instead of 6.242, you now have 6.239. And that's the effect of more people getting infected or vaccinated. And that's the concept of herd immunity. And so this is the reason the curves start to go down. Even though not everyone has been infected, there are enough people have been infected or vaccinated that whatever R naught is, which is not a good R naught, 2.75, in practice, it's now gone to below 1. And so the numbers start to go down. So that's the reason these numbers go down. And so I think I have one more thing to talk about. So we're all used to seeing these waves of infection, right? We had a wave beginning of the pandemic, and then there was a lockdown, and then there was another wave maybe in the summer, and then there was a wave in December, and so on. So how do you explain these waves? If it goes down, why should it go up again? So I don't know what the researchers think and so on. My son and I believe that these waves happen because of changes in human behavior. So this R naught, whether it is 2.75 or 5 or 2 or whatever it is based on what one sees in people in a free living situation. But people are aware about what is happening around. And also things change. So holidays bring people together. So if you're going to see more people over Christmas or Thanksgiving, then necessarily there's going to be, R naught is going to go up. There is increased risk of infection. And season changes and things we do, different seasons, also have an effect on R naught. But the point that I want to stress here, which we actually tried to simulate, is even in this insane situation where so many people died under our simulation, I think it's possible that if the death rate goes above something, that people will change their behavior. Even if the governor is insanely hostile, whatever, people are going to change their personal behavior because they read, they hear about people dying, and so they know it's from the virus. So they're going to change their behavior. They may socialize less, or they may socialize differently, whatever. So effectively lowering R naught below 1, so the infections and deaths. So this is what we think happens. And this is why, say, the curve that I showed at the beginning may not actually happen, because as the death rates become very high or above something, people in Texas or Florida are going to say, no, this is not, we're not going to take this risk. And so that change in behavior will cause the curve to come down. So now comes the next step in our reasoning, that once the deaths go down, people are going to say, okay, I guess we are out of the woods, and they'll go back to their old ways. But when they go back to their old ways, it's just going to start again, because the R naught is going to go above 1, and the infections and deaths will go up. And this is simulated in the third tab in the spreadsheet. You can look at it if you feel like it, and I'll just show a little bit from there. Also, I do want to say, this is just our little way of showing a wave. I'm sure there are many other things that go on that can result in infections and death going down and then coming up again, some cyclic phenomenon. Like I referred to holidays, season changes, but there may be other things going on. But certainly, introduction of a new variant that I mentioned here will do it, right? So things were running along with the original virus, and then the Delta took over. So the Delta took over because it had a higher R naught, because it was able to spread much more efficiently than the original virus. It became dominant. But that also means there is a new R naught. Now, instead of the 2.7 free-living R naught, you have a 7. So now, of course, it's going to go up, even if people don't change their behavior. So the third tab, I have one additional parameter. This is just one way to model. I'm not at all suggesting that this is a correct model or that I've verified it or anything. I'm just trying to simulate here R naught going down as the deaths go up. That's all. So I use a very simple formula saying if the deaths go up above 10,000, and you can change this, that people respond 2 cycles later, not immediately, because you don't know what is happening even in your state, just on a day-to-day basis. So the state may release statistics 10 days later, whatever. So 2 cycles later, you respond, and you say they may start using masks, they may use fewer people, whatever, to lower off. And so when we put that in, it starts off the same way. You remember the 2.2 million new infections and 15,000 deaths to start with. So it starts off the same way. But what you see is that even in the third cycle, the infections are declining because people see here that there were 15,000 deaths in the first cycle. And so that, I claim, it changes their behavior and causes R naught to go down, and it goes down. However, once the deaths come down to below the threshold, by this model, people will stop doing these extra precautions and will go back the way things were. And so that can lead to overweight. So this is what we have. So you have, it rises and then it falls because people change their behavior. But then after a while, the deaths go below some count. And so people go back to the way they like to, these horrible pictures I saw that people in your age group showing up at these American football games, 40,000, 50,000 people. It's sort of horrific pictures. But anyway, so people go back to that. And so then the point of this simulation is just to show how you can have waves even with this basic simple model. It just means that the R naught changes with time. It's not fixed with time. And okay, so I'll just spend a couple of more minutes for the benefit of maybe, I don't know how many of you have any interest at all in Excel formulas. And just to show you that there's nothing very complicated about the way this was implemented in Excel. So for instance, if you click on C8, which is the starting R naught, and you'll see an equation. And that equation just says that you take E2, which is the R naught for that insane region, and then you multiply that by the fraction uninfected, that's 1 minus D2, then also by the fraction unvaccinated, that's 1 minus C6. So you say 40% are vaccinated, so you take 1 minus that. You have 10% are infected, you take 1 minus that. And so you multiply all that by what the R naught might be there, free living, and you get the 1.48. That's all. Nothing very complicated. And the formula for deaths is even simpler. If you click on one of the cells, you'll see an equation that just says B2 times C13. And all that is B2 is the mortality action, which is taken to be 1%. And you say you take the previous cycle's infections and you take 1% of that. 2.275 million becomes 22,270. That's it. So the formula for deaths in our model is really trivial. And the formula for infections, though, it gets complicated. It gets very complicated in the waves tab. I won't even show you the formula there. But even in the main tab, it gets complicated because we need to know how many people are still vulnerable. So you can't just take the previous infections and multiply by R naught. So the R naught, that C7, has to be scaled. So you take the new infection, the previous cycle, and then that C7, but then it has to be scaled by the fraction uninfected and the fraction unvaccinated. And each of them involves some formulas because the vaccination is going on cycle by cycle. So the number vaccinated goes up with each cycle. And the number infected also, you have to add up all the infections till now. So the formula gets messy. So if you are interested, if you look down below at the bottom of the spreadsheet, the formulas are explained. And so the takeaway message from our model, the starting R naught under insane is just about half the Delta variant value due to nearly half the population being vaccinated, right? 2.75, 1.4 something. It's still large enough that nearly half the population end up getting infected. And 1% of that half population die as a result. So, and deaths under insane are 70 times the deaths under sane. And the low vaccination rates in the no mandate state make it hard to control the pandemic before many get infected. I mean, that's the key challenge in those states, to get more people vaccinated. And just a single mandate, you still end up with like 7 to 9 times the deaths under a policy that's much more strict. And of course, this is a point that certainly, people like my wife get very, very upset about, which is, I think Dr. Fauci, when he talks on television also, that is, the more people get infected, even if they don't get sick, it's a great opportunity for the virus to mutate. So there's another mutant coming along next year will be resistant to the vaccines that we have. That new vaccines would have to be developed to target the new variant. And that is made much more likely by more and more people getting infected. And so the parameters, if one actually wants to play with, these are the parameters that, that are yellow. And I am done. I want to stop recording. Any questions? Okay.